Svalbard Summer 2001. Svalbard, halfway between Norway and the North Pole, was a destination for 43 YEs and 12 leaders, departing London Gatwick on the 15th of July 2001 for the first 4-week trip to Svalbard. Broughton's, our airline, gave us our own check-in desk with our own name above it. Some of our leaders looked very clean and tidy, but I think the YEs were a wee bit apprehensive, although most of them were smiling. Helen, well, I'm not sure what she's sitting there thinking.
Everywhere you look, you just see mountains, and it's just pure white everywhere. The snow and ice, the Arctic desert. A lot of people don't actually see the world for what it is because of all the comforts of modern life. But then you're missing the beauty of nature. You just see the world we made for ourselves. I'm actually really looking forward to this. It's just going to be so different to anything I've ever done. I'm very easygoing. I get along with lots of people. I'm sharing a tent with 2 girls. I've not met them yet. I don't know any of these people. It's like going blindfolded into someone. It's more exciting in that sense, but then it's a bit scary in a way as well.
Leaving Tromsø, it's a 2.5-hour flight across to Svalbard, and that was the YE's first picture of Spitsbergen. Beautiful white ice caps with lots of sea around, not too much sea ice at this time of year. The expedition was to be located in the fjord called Billefjord, which is to the north of Longyearbyen, where the main party would fly into. There was an advance party went out a week beforehand. Here we see them choosing the beach at Brusbyen, where we formed our camp. They went up into the ice and found a place suitable for the ice training, and they set up our tents waiting for us at Longyearbyen when we arrived. Longyearbyen Airport, a big shed in the middle of nowhere. The chief leader arrives, briefcase in hand, with all the details. Moved down to the campsite and had a really good night's sleep. But it's not night, it's all daylight. The expedition container had arrived about a week before the advance party. But of course there's the inevitable sorting out of all the equipment, and lots of stuff had to be ferried across from where the container was to where the boat left. So we used our packs, kindly donated by Colin, one of our leaders. But there's a heck of a lot of food to move across, 1,300 man days to be precise. But it wasn't all work. Ging had his birthday, his 18th birthday, and we had to stop and celebrate that. But the YEs also had their first opportunity to cook some food.
Is that dog food?
Chicken and veg was spaced with Four Seasons casserole. Well, it's going to be like a novelty for the first few days, but then that might wear off.
Well, I've got 14 sugar cubes to go.
They also had to carry everything from where the equipment was unloaded from the container right across, so the inevitable chain gang started. Everything from barrels containing ropes through to pulks, through to all the boxes of food had to be carried across. Leaving Longyearbyen, we headed out into the fjord, and it was a 3.5-hour journey up to where our base camp was at Brusbyen. We were accompanied throughout the trip by 2 Zodiacs, the chief boatman being Chris. The Zodiacs got there before us, but as soon as we arrived in the bay at Brusbyen, we got the first group ashore and all the equipment started to be unloaded. John masterminded the whole unloading party. Everything had to be unloaded from the oil barrels right through. The next day was a day of training. Training's important in BSES and we value it very highly. Katie the doctor, packing all the emergency kits. The fuel had to be sorted out so that everybody got the right paraffin. More training on how to use stoves. Training on how to use a rifle, how to use a weapon. Some YEs had never shot one before.
When you fire it, make sure you get it into your shoulder, not your chest. And aim at a rock. Well done.
Hit it too. Did you see it?
Reload.
But if there were any bears around when they happened to be sitting at the loo, they had a little pencil flare in their pocket which they could pull out. All their tents were surrounded by tripwires at all times, which went off like bangers if anybody had to go for a wee in the middle of the night. We also had training on how to cross rivers, which was really important, as you'll see later on. The next phase of training was the mountain training, and each fire went off separately to be trained for that. Again, mountain training is really, really important. We started off learning how to use an ice axe breaking, Colin showing us just how to do it all. Everybody had to row across the ground. Then, having got the confidence in using your ice axe, how to cut steps, how to coil a rope, use the rope as a chairlift, and again, how to use your rope to set up a pulley system to pull someone out of a crevasse. All this work towards the culmination of pulling your leader out of a crevasse. The leaders loved it, at least some more so than others, and some gave more help than others. But all in all, training went brilliantly. After the training, we split up into 4 fires. And in order to move around, we had to use the boats a lot. So the boats were used for transporting people. Here we see survey fire going off, not just for transporting the chief leader around. But Chris was the only boatman, so he had to make sure he got people trained up very quickly in the use of boats. Most of them had had experience before, but never in Spitsbergen. Sean and David. Here we see Colin being taken off to the base of the glacier. Ging was another boatman, and he loved to take the girls in his boats. Here we see Shona going off. Geese used the boats to transport all their equipment again to the end of the glacier. But Katie, the poor duck, got left behind. This is what an Australian looks like when she's cold. The 4 fires worked in 2 fires in Ebadallen, fluvial and survey fire. The geology fire worked to the east of base camp, and geese worked to the south of base camp in Gypstallen. Geology fire headed up into the hills with their ropes, their sledges, their pokes, all their equipment. We know that occasionally they had days off or had a few hours off and they rested a bit. They played a bit. They got caught in snowstorms and got their tents all snowed up. But at the end of it, they would come out on a nice bright sunny day, have some food, and they knew that the chief leader was watching them from down below on the foreshore. And they saw some wonderful geology, some absolutely superb geology. Bill drew this sketch of Ormstomfjellet, and together the fire made the most wonderful geological map and cross sections. Geology fire disappeared on day 1 and came back 3 hours before the boat departed on the last night, so we just didn't see them. The second fire was goose fire, sometimes called goose, sometimes called geese, depending on what their leaders decided to call them that day. Leaders went off in search of geese. They headed down Gypstallen and around the beautiful cliffs in the valley of Gypstallen. They caught and put into the nets some 180 geese. Carl is qualified goose ringer, and he got the YEs to work with him and ring the geese. Prima, not too sure whether she's going to turn vegetarian or not. Put some tracking on the geese, but unfortunately all the geese disappeared. They're not supposed to at this time of year, but they did. The fire then returned back up to Bruce Bain again, where they went in search of some more geese, but not before visiting the huts, which are there from the Scottish Spitsbergen Syndicate days when there was coal mining done in this area. Here we see Lara sitting in one of the huts. Beside the most beautiful glacier, the Northern Sholbren Glacier, Carl and Chris putting into the nets the geese, ringing them, and Chris watching the geese just to make sure they're happy before they go off. Geese fire were also interested in the plants, only after a few days they were soon up into the mountains to get onto the ice. They had a lot of load carrying to do. They would carry, they would unpack, they would go down to the bottom again before they would head back up onto the ice. But they had wonderful days up there. Maybe a bit more snow than everybody else, depended which side of the hill you were on.
How's it feeling, Chris?
Knackered. That's basically it.
Basically, you just keep on going. Just what do you think about is the next step, and try and not look in the distance, because then you realise that how much further you got to go. Oops. Just crossing a narrow stream there. I think just over these couple of hills, isn't it?
The other two fires, Survey Fire and Fluvial Fire, were over in Ebodallen, which was a short boat ride away from the base camp at Bruce Bain. Ebodallen was the most beautiful valley, a small valley right in the middle of a major geological fault zone, which kept some of the leaders happy. It was useful because it was small, and it was good to be able to work survey and fluvial together. Traditional plain table survey techniques were used. They had to stand in the stream. Sometimes they would go up the mountain to set up their sites. But overall, they made the most wonderful map, which caused their leaders one or two headaches to try and actually get it drawn up. While they were there were two birthdays. One was Hannah, who had her 18th birthday. The other was John, one of our older leaders, or should I say more experienced leaders, whose birthday, let's just say, the candles nearly set the pot alight. And here we have the two cake bakers. But again, all too soon, after 9 or 10 days, it was time to go up onto the ice. They got some wonderful weather, and John travelled around with his team of survey behind him.
Midday, 26th July 2001. Crossing the glaciers with the crampons, ropes, ice axe, all the usual bits. And the view is fantastic. It's not a totally cold day, just wearing a t-shirt and the fleece, mainly because I'm walking and keeping myself warm. But it's an amazing view, it's just fantastic.
The idea for Survey Fire was that they would go to McDonaldriggin. McDonaldriggin was some 50 kilometres to the east of where they set off on the ice. Alistair had been there in the 1950s when he was a student at Cambridge and had had a mountain named after him, Alistair MacDonald, McDonaldriggin. Here we see him in the same equipment as he travelled in when he was a boy in Cambridge. But sadly, the travelling conditions weren't good. They weren't able to go far, the weather wasn't great, but the girls made a really good attempt at it. They had to turn back once they got to the watershed. They just didn't have good enough travelling conditions and headed down back to base camp again. Some in different style to others. When down at base camp, the whole of Survey Fire got together and said thank you to our two most experienced leaders, in the party.
Right, next one.
This is VJ now. What I want to do this morning is we're all going to walk around. We're going to go up this valley first of all and have a look for potential sources, potential inputs. And then we're going to come round, probably round the front of the glacier and go up towards that waterfall and have a look at that. And then I've got 3 sets of waders, which we may or may not need this morning. I couldn't get across there in my little wellies last night, but we might do this morning, to go and have a closer look at that waterfall.
Our 4th fire was fluvial fire. Now fluvial love water. It says it all. Fluvials love to play around in streams, and they used the main stream coming down Ebedallen. They had 4 different sites that they worked on and did different records, sometimes over a 24-hour period, sometimes just for 2 or 3 hours at a time. It all involved getting wet, and I think they were rather keen on getting wet. They measured the flow of the river by painting the stones yellow, dropping them into the water, and then seeing how far the different numbered stones got. They had a couple of floods while they were there, and the river completely changed patterns. They were able to sieve the sediments, and several of the YEs used the work that they did there for their A-level projects, Catherine included. Tim, the leader of the fluvial fire, was also the overall chief scientist, and we've already got the science report written and ready to be handed out to the YEs. But again, the fluvials, just not content with the rivers, they had to do something better than everybody else, and of course they were the ones who found the bear paws. When did the bear last visit? Was it a mummy bear? Was it a baby bear? Well, looking by the size of these pairs, it was probably a baby bear, quite a young one. Fluvials also had this thing about going up mountains. Might be at the end of a day's work, might be at the end of a day's training, but they had this thing about going up mountains, and I think it was just to see if they could see the river any better. But what goes up must come down, and what comes down must ultimately cross the river.
We seem to have not negotiated the river right, and we're on a really steep part, which is really deep, and only a few little rocks to get across. The guys behind us found a narrow bit, of course, but we're still just going to try and cross this bit. 4 of us have made it so far. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 are waiting to try and get across, but they're stopped halfway just to take pictures on the river.
But it's nice to see that the age of chivalry is not past. Again, once they'd got their fluvial work finished, they headed off up onto the ice, and I had some wonderful travelling. Each of the YEs took part, or they pulled their own pokes, they climbed mountains. Here we see Hannah, Becky, and Vicky, with one of their leaders, David. VJ, I don't know where he got his skull from. It certainly didn't come back to the UK with us. Helen and her tent mate Vicky. Again, all too soon, it was time to return back to the base camp, but the girls went fishing while the boys went off and did the work. Not sure whether they caught any fish or not. Just to show that BSES is not just into the physical sciences, but that the young explorers are keen to learn more about the landscape around them, we encourage as many as possible to take photographs and to draw pictures. Chris, the boatman, was also a very good artist, and he worked with several YEs. Here we see Philippa resting after doing some paintings, some wonderful line drawings, and 2 wonderful watercolours. There's lots more to be seen at the gathering. We also made a tape recording, which was broadcast in a gap year project. VJ was the star of that show.
All of a sudden, these pretty birds that we saw flying around started screaming and then dive bombing us, trying to pick our heads. I think they got us a couple of times, but then after that, we took a walking pole with us to hold it up, and the turns go for the pole rather than our heads, which was a lot nicer and easier to get the water.
Oh, wow! They love you. They've got Catherine twice now.
Swears that it works perfectly. I think you should get a good hat.
The doctor, Katie, didn't have too much to do, but here we see her operating on Sarah, who had to be kept quiet during the whole process. Rosalie's the able assistant helping out. What other leaders have we not met? Chris and Lorraine spent their time at base camp, moving people around, moving people up onto the glacier, wherever they were needed. But all good things must come to an end, even for BSES. The final phase was a walk back to Longyearbyen, but because of bad weather, we had to wait for the Langøysund, the boat that took us out originally, to come, pick us up and move us down the fjord. Colin and Ewan weren't too convinced whether the boat was going to arrive or not. We had to wait a while so people played around. Here we see Harriet in the water. Some others went off and had a bath. Bill headed out, not to be outdone. He was followed by Lucy. Pretty cold bath, I think. Some others just decided to rest after a job well done. And here, Ben, doing what he's usually doing, eating. 3 hours down the coast, the Langøysund dropped everybody off at Darbisodden at midnight, at exactly midnight. It was beginning to get dark by now. It was the middle of August. Well, dark by Spitsbergen standards. 2.5 days later, walking through the hills, the YEs had some of the most beautiful views of the area that they'd visited, and completely different parts of Spitsbergen over different watersheds.
The expedition's changed me totally. I'm just a lot more confident. I've been to the Arctic. It gives you that kind of Superman feeling, shall we say, like another obstacle that will come your way, and I would not fear it as much as I might have done, and I could handle it. I think I can cope with most things now. More things than I definitely could have done before this trip. You need trust, confidence, you need to bond with people in order to survive and to have a good time.
While 4 or 5 of us leaders went back to Longyearbyen, unloaded the boat and had to pack the container. There weren't very many of us compared to the 50 odd who'd loaded the boat in the first place, so we had to use ingenious methods of transporting the equipment. But 2.5 days later, all the YEs arrived back. Most of them headed straight for the local cafe. Some of them went and sent emails. Others had a review on the beach. Not sure what Sam and Ed are up to here. Duncan was wonderful. Duncan was the deputy chief leader, and he was wonderful. He sorted everybody out. He even helped out Rosalie when she was lost. She didn't even know where she'd been. But we soon put her right. The airport at Longyearbyen, just like all airports. Few tears when people were leaving, but at the end of it, it was something that we'll all remember. Thank you to all the leaders and to all the YEs for making it 4 super weeks.
Ladakh, a high-altitude desert in the heart of the Himalaya mountain range, the highest and the youngest mountains in the world. On the borders of India, Pakistan and Tibet, Ladakh offers a unique destination for an expedition. But it wasn't always like this. First, there was the advance party. The advance party did an absolutely superb job of recceing and acquiring kit, everything from shovels to minor food mountains, so that by the time we arrived in base camp, there was a base camp. And a base camp with the kettle already on. But I'm getting ahead of the story here. For the rest of us, and the rest of us was 50 young expeditioners and about 14 leaders, our journey began at Heathrow, where we took the red-eye flight overnight from London to Delhi. Arriving in the apparent confusion and chaos of Delhi in the early hours of the morning. We then set out on an epic journey by bus from Delhi, more or less due north, up towards Manali. A journey which took us through a wide variety of different villages, towns and landscapes, climbing steadily as we went, and featuring a number of most extraordinary accommodation. We took advantage of some extraordinarily scenic roadside camp spots. And then finally we arrived in Manali, where we spent a couple of days sorting kit, sleeping, sightseeing, and generally getting ourselves organized. Back on the buses, we were heading out of Manali across an extraordinary set of road passes, including the Rohtang Pass and the Baralachala, heading for the head of the Karnak Valley, where we would leave the road and head down towards base camp. Highlights included many stops at a variety of dhabas who served us extraordinary food, sometimes Tibetan. And also provided us with a range of very stylish hats. The journey also provided us many opportunities for acclimatization walks, which were proved to be vital by the time we reached base camp. They also provided the opportunity for the dreaded cognitive tests.
Wow. Matt, explain what this is. Oh, this is a clicker test. You've got to press the button as many times as you can in 30 seconds. Go.
Base camp by the shores of the beautiful Zara River. Shortly after we reached base camp, Pete, our chief leader, sadly had to leave us to fly back to Delhi and on to America. But we were left in the very, very competent hands of Nick, who took over as chief leader from that point. For the rest of us, base camp initially was a matter of sorting our supplies, acquainting ourselves with our food, and more importantly, how on earth we were going to cook it, figuring out our sleeping arrangements, and learning important tasks like how to strain custard. We also needed to familiarise ourselves again with our tents and other forms of accommodation, and in general to figure out how we were going to live in this strange new environment at about 13,500 feet without polluting the water and without having too much of a negative impact on the environment and the surrounding people, many of whom came to visit us, including Buddhist monks and the nomads. Jule, Jule became a common cry. From base camp, the fires took it in turns to set off, travelling light and under-equipped towards the Advanced Mountain Base Camp, or ABC. ABC was in the tender, gentle hands of our chief mountaineer, Keith, and was situated close to the village of Pangchung, which many of us were lucky enough to be able to visit. Some of the residents also visited us in turn. Their lifestyle was extraordinarily different from ours, very lacking in material possessions, apart from the yaks and the sheep who often went through ABC. And prompted a lot of difficult questions about whether it would be appropriate to call these people poor and what wealth actually means. One thing they certainly did seem to have was a lot of happiness. From ABC, we did a series of acclimatization walks, setting us up to have the best possible chance of getting to the summit at nearly 6,000 feet. For many of us, this was a pretty arduous, long slog of a day, prompting profound philosophical questions like, what the heck am I doing here? For most people, however, the summit was a truly life-changing experience. With astonishing views of 360 degrees of mountains, including the Karakoram Range, and some pretty satisfied emotions afterwards. Meanwhile, back at base camp, we'd been joined by Tripod, the three-legged dog who stayed with us off and on for the rest of the trip. We brushed up on our climbing skills and techniques. To get there, we had to cross the Zara River, whose water was so excruciatingly cold that a number of people took alternative transport. From base camp, the fires set out again on their trekking phases. On these phases, we were totally self-sufficient, right down to the umbrella. These phases were an opportunity to combine trekking with continued work on our science projects. Survey Fire did some surveying. Ethnobotanists asked a whole range of questions, including about the way in which the altitude and physical location affected the plant life. The geomorphologists were able to explain to the rest of us, or tried to anyway, how the extraordinary rock formations came to be where they were and how they were. The trekking phases were also an opportunity to visit other villages, a particularly spectacular one just down from us, down the Zara River. What would it be like, really, to live here? Sustainable tourism thought a lot and deeply about what the impact of an increased tourism in this valley might mean for these fragile and extraordinary cultures. Science and creativity, of course, go together, and there were lots of opportunity for both, including some experiments inspired by Rachel in environmental art. Environmental philosophy thought about what it meant for humans to be in this kind of extraordinary mountain landscape. And the whole expedition considered questions about how we should minimize our impact on this extraordinary ecosystem, and also on the local people, many of whom would never have seen anything quite like us. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine. There was an extraordinary amount of rain, in fact, for a high-altitude desert. And a number of epics, including a hole in a diesel tank and a high-altitude major surgery performed in the mess tent with very little anaesthetic, followed, I'm glad to say, by a full recovery and a number of other minor operations. The sustainable tourism fire escaped briefly to enjoy the highlights of Leh and to question tourists that they uncovered there. And then it was a big reunion for all of us back at base camp. With a rather controversial slaughter of a sheep for our farewell celebratory lunch. For many of us, it was a rather sad goodbye to base camp and the beautiful Zara River, followed by the walk out or truck out back to the roadhead. And a last night under the stars. From there, it was the beginning of the long, long journey back over the passes to the mixed benefits, blessings and disadvantages of an urban and human-dominated lifestyle. I'm not sure an expedition like this can be summed up. Overall, well, we pushed ourselves mentally and physically. We learned a lot about ourselves. We learned about cooperating and not cooperating with other people, and we went through a whole range of positive and negative emotions. We made new and closer friends. And we were honoured to have a bit of an insight into a culture that was extraordinarily different from anything that most of us had witnessed before. Above all, perhaps, we experienced some astonishingly beautiful mountain desert landscape.
I'm Tony Whiting, Chief Leader, and this is my story in pictures and sound bites of the BSES expedition to the White Mountains of Alaska. There were many obstacles to be overcome before we set off, and we even considered we might go elsewhere, but in the event we did not, and so made many friends and colleagues. No doubt there are stories aplenty from this experience just waiting to be told. It is the unique BSES experience of 6 field weeks and the special matrix of survival skills, leadership and self-confidence that will set the young explorers apart from their peers in the future. Our area of operation totaled 5,000 square miles. It was much explored and, uniquely, BSES AK-1 undertook not 1 but 7 or more long marches. The expedition encountered much wildlife, some prickly and slow, others fast, dangerous and hungry, and others much prized by the hunters. We had problems with feet and ankles. We saw northern lights many times. All the leaders gave much of their free time, and everyone made close friends, never to be lost. Some learned and practiced new skills, and in addition, we all managed to have time to reflect. At the end, we were all tired, but after all, it was an expedition, not an activity holiday. Particular thanks must go to Malcolm Bell, the Chief Scientist, and to Tony Wilby, the Deputy Chief Leader. An expedition is all about people, and this group was especially memorable. Great land, it's called. You've arrived.
It was pretty horrible because the rice wouldn't cook properly and so got pretty bad, but the lentils were alright. But then the jello wouldn't set either, so we have very runny vanilla jello, which is very yummy indeed.
Good fun. The manoeuvrability was not very good. I preferred a canoe or a kayak, but had to use the stern rudder a bit to turn it around, but hopefully we should get there in the end.
Well, we're trying an experiment to see, test out different materials used for hardening the trail for motorized recreation use. This is kind of a new use of this particular material. It's called geoblock. We have a lot of wetlands and boggy areas here in Alaska, and so this is to try to harden the trail to be able to still use motorized vehicles on the trails without causing a lot more impacts than are necessary.
Right, the river's risen, so we can't actually cross it. So we're going to go and measure how much it's receding at its speed, so that we can figure out when we'll be able to cross it.
fall into the river, the thing that's going to save you is the life jacket. You got to remember that if you decide you're going to jump into the river, that you can't panic, you know? Don't panic. Don't lose your paddle, because everybody's going to have a paddle. So if you do fall in, and here you can see how shallow it is, chances are you're going to just bounce on the ground before your life jacket will have any chance to do flotation for you. So if you do fall in, make sure that you face downstream, that your knees are bent, and your toes are out of the water, and you're facing downstream. And I want 3 ladies and 3 gentlemen. And I use that term loosely. Because I'm not sure what you guys are, but...
What's been the most memorable day, do you think?
Shaving John's head.
Shaving John's head. No, the night hike. We had a night hike. Oh no, the most memorable for me was
the river crossing.
No, we did it on the first day of the long march. We walked up Tabletop, and 2 of us from the fire, me and Richard, bivvied on the actual summit, and we saw the Northern Lights. That was really good.
You'll come to a place where the streets are not marked. Some windows are lighted, but mostly they're dark.
So this is an expedition and not a holiday. We have fun, and we're going to save the world. Hey, we're the Bear Fire. We keep on marching around. We're too busy growling to put anybody down.
One day in October, the Duke, who were always tough, having no battles on at the moment, had given his lads the day off.
Take